A story about a usurper who ends up getting killed at the end due to his own hubris. Hey, wait, haven't we read this story already? We haven't? This time the main character tells you himself outright that he is the bad guy and is so cartoonishly evil it's almost funny? Well then, let's take a look! Richard III is considered one of Shakespeare's history plays, but sometimes it's considered a tragedy. Or both, I guess. I mean, the main character dies at the end, so it basically is a tragedy, but it is also about an actual king from way, way back in the day. But like how we discussed when reviewing Julius Caesar, Shakespeare did do a little embellishing when telling this story. It was likely written in the 1592 to 1594 range. Personally, I would speculate that it was written around 1592. Why? Well, when I was in college studying Shakespeare, my professor had us play a little game where us students would pretend to be high officials in the medieval government, and we had to debate which play to show at the theater, which was closed for plague and was going to be reopened. The two plays in question for this debate were Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, and of course Shakespeare's Richard III. Now, the time period this little game was supposed to take place in was 1593. Now, I don't think this was a game my professor came up with. Like, he had a whole book for it and everything. I can't for the life of me remember what it was called, and I cannot find the book to show you, but it was a pretty neat history lesson. Anyway, this play is supposed to depict the short reign of King Richard III. Now, Shakespeare wrote other history plays before this, but this play in particular is supposed to conclude the story of the plays Henry VI, parts 1 through 3. And I am serious saying this, parts 1 through 3 are their own individual plays. Also, this play is structured a little weird. Not the story itself, but how the characters are labeled in the play itself, like the script. For example, Richard III himself is labeled as Gloucester, but that is because that's his original title before King, Duke of Gloucester. It's the same thing for a couple of other characters like Richard's brother George, labeled as Clarence, since that is his title, Duke of Clarence. So relax, that's just how everyone's labeled and called, you'll be fine. Also, a lot of the characters have the same name, which is why they were probably labeled by title. Anyways, the story begins after a fierce civil war between the royal houses of York and Lancaster. The House of York won, and King Edward IV is currently reigning. Now, King Edward is Richard's brother. Richard resents his happiness and is also bitter about his physical deformity. He wants everyone to be as miserable as he is and plots to take the throne. He's willing to kill anyone he has to in order to get it. First, Richard plots to kill his other brother, George, Duke of Clarence. The plan is to get him arrested and then have him killed later, which is exactly what happens. Clarence is arrested, Richard arranges for a couple of assassins to sneak into Clarence's prison, where they drown him in wine. Meanwhile, Richard decides he needs a queen, so he meets up with Lady Anne, who is the widow of Henry VI's son, who is also named Edward. And Richard was actually the one who killed him in battle along with Henry VI. The fact that he was even able to get Anne to agree to be his wife despite her knowing that he was the one who killed her first husband should tell you how good he is at the art of manipulation. Now what about King Edward? Why hasn't Richard killed him yet? Well, it's because King Edward is currently very sick. And to drive the process a little faster, Richard tells King Edward that he is to blame for Clarence's death. Because it is true that King Edward wanted him to be executed, but then changed his mind and wanted him released. However, Richard says that the sentence has already been carried out. Well, the king is dead, and Richard is now Lord Protector. Basically, he's in charge until the Prince Edward V is old enough to take charge on his own. Well, Richard then begins his killing spree. First, he gets rid of all the noblemen loyal to the prince, then he gets rid of the prince's relatives on his mother's side. Now Richard is able to have the Duke of Buckingham and his other allies campaign for Richard to be king. How is this possible? Well, Richard has started to spread rumors that King Edward's sons are not really his. The campaign is successful, and Richard has the prince and his brother sent to the Tower of London, where they are later killed by a couple of murderers Richard hired. Well, now everyone is very much afraid of Richard. The common people begin to hate him. Buckingham even turns against him and goes to help the Earl of Richmond build up an army to fight Richard. Now, Richmond is the nephew of Henry VI. So yeah, he would love to avenge his uncle. Let's just say that. Meanwhile, Richard wishes to secure his power further, so he has his wife Lady Anne killed and intends to marry his niece. Now, Richard does try to manipulate her mother, Elizabeth, into agreeing to this arrangement, but she instead stalls for time by telling him she'll get back to him on her answer. His manipulations do not work on her. Richard has now lost control of events and his power is slipping. Rebellions have started up, and Richmond is invading soon. Buckingham is captured and executed as a traitor, then Richmond begins the invasion. However, the night before, both Richmond and Richard are visited by ghosts. These are the ghosts of Richard's many victims. The ghosts bless Richmond with success, while they curse Richard. During the battle the next day, many of Richard's men desert him. Richard does his best to fight, but it's not enough. He is killed by Richmond, who takes the throne, becoming King Henry VII. And that's where the story ends. Now, I'm sure you noticed a few similarities between this and Macbeth. However, there is one major difference. Macbeth actually starts out as a hero, but descends into villainy through desire for power and his insistence on keeping it. Richard, right off the bat, tells the audience that he is going to be the bad guy. I always found that interesting and kind of funny. He is both protagonist and antagonist to the story. We see him rise to power and then fall. It's interesting to have an antagonist take the protagonist role. You get a good idea of Richard's thought process and how he's able to manipulate others. I still can't get over how he was able to manipulate Anne into marrying him. He quite literally told her that he caused all of that bloodshed because of her beauty, and even told her to kill him if she was so mad. Well, she didn't end up doing it. So much death could have been avoided if she just killed him. But then we wouldn't have a story, and the play would have been over in like 5 minutes. I've always found the battle scene rather interesting as well. We see Richard get haunted by the ghosts of those he's killed. While he may not have killed them himself, he had them killed by other means. He even tries to justify his actions after the experience, even though he knows that literally everyone will be happy when he dies. And then on the battlefield, he has fully descended into madness and sees every man he fights as Richmond. I think that it shows he's not only lost control of his power, but also his mind. It's the full descent leading up to his death. Now, I didn't mention this in the summary, but Henry VI's widow, Queen Margaret, appears near the beginning and curses all of the members of King Edward's court. She warns them about Richard, and they do nothing about it since she was banished, and they were trying to push her out. They were like, yeah, Grandma, let's get you out of here, get you to bed. This is more of a case of ignoring the prophecy rather than trying to avoid the prophecy being fulfilled. There's also a hint of foreshadowing through dreams. I've already mentioned the haunting of Richard, but there's one thing I haven't mentioned. Before Clarence is killed, he has a dream about being drowned, and then he is killed via drowning. It's not the first time dreams have been used as foreshadowing, but it's always fun to see. You might have also noticed the theme of how misery desires company. Richard is bitter about his physical deformity and wishes everyone else to be as miserable as he is. The crown is mostly just a bonus, although it is a nice bonus, which is why he intends to keep it. Overall, it's an interesting play. I do like how the story moved, although I did not enjoy all the scenes, but that was mostly because I hated Richard as a character. Now, I should clarify, Richard is a character you're supposed to hate, and that's what I mean by I hated him. While yes, he does get his comeuppance at the end, I still cringe a little bit at how he manipulates those around him and some other scenes, but I think that just means the story is doing its job right. I'd recommend this play for ages 16 and up. Like with other Shakespeare plays, the language is a bit hard to understand, and some of the ways Richard manipulates his victims is a bit disturbing. There were several film adaptations of the play, along with a couple TV adaptations. The one I've seen is from an episode of the show The Hollow Crown. It's a really good adaptation, I'd recommend it. I guess there are lots of stories with this kind of structure, but not many where the protagonist is also the antagonist, at least from what I've seen. Maybe I just need to read more. I hope this helps you in your studies. Happy reading!